Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Here we are. It is March 21st. 2025. And
good morning.
The reason I want to put these, good morning. The reason I want to put these dates is things are moving so rapidly that just in the 1 week since we had our last podcast, a whole bunch of things have taken place, mostly in Washington. And
I think the Chinese have a proverb that may you live in interesting times.
Yes.
And that's a two-edged sword.
Yes, it is. That's another proverb. Or another saying. So you got
two.
You got
two already.
Two already. Okay. So at any rate, what I thought we'd do today is we're going to talk about what's going on in the U.S. right now. We're going to talk about what we think it means going forward, and then we're going to compare that to the policies that are going on now and what it means to the policies of the Depression and what actually happened. Because I think it's you learn from history.
Sure.
And even at my age, I did not live in the Depression. Close, but I didn't.
I remember one thing you said to me early on when we just first getting started, that it's much better to learn from somebody else's mistakes. So just being interested and observant saves you a lot of money.
Yeah, it does. And it also, I think you're not as stunned by what's going on, and I think you have the ability to kind of predict when changes are taking place, they're going to have an effect. Right. They're going to have a forward effect, and if you have a sense of how those same types of changes, maybe they were the opposite, but then you can assume that if a set of changes had an effect in the 30s, and then you do something that's the opposite of that. Now, you would expect that the results would be not necessarily the opposite, but very different from what they were in the 30s.
Well, a better understanding doesn't necessarily give you control, but it does make things coherent.
Yes, there you go. All right. So anyway, let's just talk about, and then what I want to do is after that, I want to talk about China today and where it sits and because I read a very interesting article. It's what's wrong with China in 8 charts. And I looked at that. I said, this is very interesting because if you have policies in China that result in certain outcomes, human nature is there are different cultures, but human nature when it comes to economic activity in relationship to public policy, that spans across any of the cultures. And so we're going to use China to kind of understand what our situation is versus China, but also recognize that China is in a very different position today than it was 20 years ago.
Right.
So let's get cracking here. In the last week, last Friday, actually, the continuing resolution was approved by the Senate and signed into law by President Trump. And what that did, let's just review kind of what that did.
First of all, what it is, which is a mechanism to just keep the government going, kind of on the terms it has been going with a little bit of change, but it's not major legislation. It's kind of a kick the can down the road. Let's keep going this way until we figure out a bigger, better way.
Yeah, I think that's well said because all it did was it said the federal government's fiscal year begins October 1st. Previously, they had passed 2 continuing resolutions that lasted 90 days each. So half of the year has already operated on continuing resolutions. So last Friday, they said we're going to go ahead and extend the continuing resolution for the remaining 6 months, but we're going to make these slight changes. They cut spending $13 billion.
Which is pretty tiny in the scale of things.
Yeah, but they did increase defense spending and border security. So the net effect was a reduction in federal spending of $6 billion out of a $7 trillion budget, and so it was
these are trims around the edges for the time being because they can't get agreement on a bigger deal.
Right, and but the result of that was very interesting to me because Chuck Schumer is the minority leader of the Democrats in the Senate, and the left, and I think this is a reasonably accurate term. He capitulated at the end and allowed the continuing resolution to be brought to the floor for a vote without a filibuster.
And by capitulation, we mean there's been pretty uniform resistance or opposition to everything that the Republicans are doing. The Democrats vote completely the opposite way.
Right.
And in this case, they were expected to do that. They were saying they were going to do that. And then when you say capitulated, he said, we're not going to do that this time. And he's angered a lot of his peers, a lot of his party members.
Yes.
But his reasoning was if he didn't do that, the government was going to get shut down and they were going to be blamed for it, properly so, because there was a deal to keep the government going, and they were going to oppose it.
Yeah, and he said one other thing that is completely accurate. He said that if the government were, quote, shut down, when that happens, whoever is president at the time does have the authority to decide what are essential services, and the essential services continue to operate.
Right.
So it's not a total shutdown.
Yes.
And so what Schumer was trying to explain when he would go on television to explain why he reversed his previous position was that he said if you think DOGE is bad, giving Trump the authority to cut whatever he wanted to, and we would be doing that, would have been terrible. And so that part's correct. But what upset people was how he said he was going to stand with the Democrats in the House and he was not going to let this continuing resolution pass, because the Senate Democrats did have the authority, the power to filibuster. What he explained was we took that position because we didn't think the Republicans could unite and pass it in the House with no Democrat support.
You know, what's interesting about this is it's essentially a conservative move. Remember when we did the Giants of Political Thought in our publishing business, we talked about Edmund Burke. And he said, you better not tear it down until you know what you're going to put back in place. Remember?
Yep.
Well, that's essentially what he said. We don't have anything to put in its place. You're going to shut the government down, whatever that means. And there's nothing but the president's discretion to put in its place until we get something else.
Yeah. So, and giantsofpoliticalthought.com is what you and I started many years ago. And Edmund Burke was writing the reflections on the revolution in France.
Yes.
So this was what he was saying is to the French, don't have your revolution unless you know what you're going to do. They didn't listen to him.
Right.
And they had the French Revolution that went from 1789 to about 1794. 20 to 30,000 French people were killed. The economy shrunk by 60% over 15 years. And it was a terrible, terrible period. And it was only resolved when the French became exhausted fighting each other, and then Napoleon rose to power and became a dictator. So they rebelled against a king who was a dictator and ended up 15 years later with a dictator who was not called a king.
I think it's interesting also to note that conservative literally means to keep things as they are, to conserve things, right? And liberal is to liberate them and change them. Those terms have inverted over time, where today conservative more means favor of small government.
Right.
Which would be a change to get back to small government. That would be liberating and not conservative.
Yes.
Right? So the terms have a very contextual meaning in history, and we have to be careful on who we call conservative, because we just noted that Chuck Schumer was conservative last week.
Yeah, for a moment.
Yes.
I wonder how he felt at that moment. But at any rate,
you can ask him.
So now here's where we are now. We've just had the continuing resolution passed, which, as you point out, really didn't change things much at all. Now you're going to have in May. I saw Mike Johnson on one of the Sunday talk programs, and he said in May the House will pass what he calls the one big beautiful bill.
Yeah, that's Trump's term.
That's Trump's term, but
yes.
They're now calling it that.
Right.
And what will be included in that bill, and I don't know if this is all that will be included, but
And
I know
just for listeners who don't know, there's been debate about whether they should separate tax cuts from other legislation and do it in steps, and the strategy they've arrived at to do it all at one time.
Yes, and the two things they were talking about separating was the tax cuts and defense and border. So defense and border was going to be one bill.
Right.
Tax cuts were going to be another. And Trump said I would go with either, but I would prefer one big beautiful bill. And so that's his term.
In terms of speaking of conservatism, the tax cuts are not really going to be new tax cuts. They're preserving tax cuts that were made in 2017. They're conserving tax cuts so that in current law they expire and they're supposed to go back to prior tax levels.
Right.
So what we're calling a tax cut now means to remove the escalation that's in current law, put it to where taxes currently are and have been since 2017. So in a sense, we're conserving tax rates.
Yes, but so let's just finish on that one point, and that is what they're going to do is they're going to make the tax cuts of 2017 permanent. So they're not going to extend extend them.
Yeah,
they're going to
good.
make them permanent.
Yeah.
So that in order to raise taxes again, you'll have to vote to raise taxes and not just let a previous tax cut expire. But that's one thing. But the other thing they're talking about doing that Mike Johnson said that will be included, he said we are going to make the 2017 tax cuts permanent, but we're also going to eliminate taxes on tips. We're going to eliminate taxes on overtime. And we're going to eliminate taxes on people on Social Security for people who are retired. And
that's brand new. It's not conservative in any way. It's changing things.
And those are new tax cuts. But what's interesting is this, and I kind of compare the way that the Republicans are approaching how to help people who have lower and middle incomes versus how the Democrat Party does it. The Democrat Party does it by giving things like tax credits. Earned income tax credits. And even if you don't work at all, you can apply for the tax credits. What Trump is saying is if you work and you get tips, we're going to reward you for your work. If you work overtime, which by definition is working really hard, that we're going to have you not pay taxes on your overtime pay. So
this
Trump
is a critical distinction because rewarding you means letting you keep your money.
Right.
From the right. From the left, it means we're going to give you your money back in some fashion that we write the rules for.
Well, or give you money that you didn't even earn. What I'm saying is the earned income welfare, as the way the Democrats do it, is you receive the money as a matter of right, whether or not you worked or not.
Yes.
And Republicans are saying if you work, we're going to let you keep. We believe you should keep more of your money.
Yes.
And so one is rewarding work, and one is rewarding, frankly, not working. And so those are the two parties. Well, and so as much angst, and here's what I wanted to discuss with you: as much angst as there was with the continuing resolution passing, which is we agree was more or less a nothing burger. In May, what they're going to pass in May is much more substantial in nature than what just passed. How do you think, and that will pass by reconciliation, so, which means in the Senate that the Republicans, because it's a tax issue, tax and spending issues can be resolved by reconciliation. Oh, the other thing that will be included in the May bill is an increase in spending for the border and an increase in spending for certain things in the military. I think the Golden Dome. By the way, I've talked to some people from Notre Dame. They're a little disturbed that Trump is calling it the Golden Dome. They said they had that first. I was born in South Bend. I'm offended.
So they have a beautiful Golden Dome building there, but the Golden Dome we're talking about is a missile defense shield like they have in Israel that we're going to build for ourselves.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Which would be different. It would serve the same purpose, but I think it'll be much, much more high-tech. Than
the Golden Dome.
Than in Israel. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Israel is a bunch of rockets that shoot up and hit other rockets.
Okay.
And they can do that because Israel is relatively small geographically.
Yes.
There's a much larger area to cover. Yeah. My guess is it'll be laser based, maybe even space based. It'll be quite something.
Let's say a word about reconciliation, because those are special rules for passing legislation, right? Normally you have majority requirements or supermajority requirements for some things, and reconciliation is a process that's intended to help reconcile bills from the Senate and the House. I don't really know all the details, but it's a lesser standard. You don't have to have 60 votes or supermajorities for some things.
Yes.
And so they've qualified this legislation to be eligible under the rules for reconciliation.
Under Senate rules.
Under Senate rules.
Senate rules. Because under House rules, a simple majority wins. In the Senate, unless it's certain types of bills, you have to get to 60 votes to turn off the filibuster.
Right.
And that's what that reconciliation is a way the majority on certain types of bills can say we don't need a filibuster is not allowed.
Yes. So you can pass it with 51%.
51 votes.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what looks like will happen in May is that this great one big beautiful bill will pass, which is much more consequential than the March bill that just passed. So what do you think the reaction will be by the left? Because they can't get mad at Schumer per se because he didn't have any power to filibuster. That's being taken away from him by the majority party in the Senate, which is the Republicans. But I still think he's going to be blamed.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're in the same situation in May as they have been in the last month, which is if they don't allow this to happen, if they try to stop it, and they can't really if the Republicans stick together. Remember, there was one vote that defected from Republicans this last time. So we could do all the vote counting. It's very close, one or two votes here and there. But my sense is that in May, aren't the Democrats going to be in a similar position that if they
the difference is
oppose, they're in favor, they put themselves in a position of shutting down the government?
No. The May does not shut down the government. The May bill will cut taxes.
Yeah.
It will make the 2017 permanent.
Okay.
It will increase spending for the border, and it will increase spending for particular military projects. That's what the bill will do for May. The difference is that for the continuing resolution, if Schumer had wanted to, he could have filibustered and shut down the government in May because Republicans are going to invoke reconciliation. Schumer cannot filibuster. They can't do anything.
Right.
And so if as long as 51 Republicans in the Senate, in fact, as long as 50, because Vance would cast the deciding vote, as long as 50 Republicans vote for it, then it will. And if the House passes it first, which is what has to be done.
Right.
But what I'm saying is I think Schumer, then it will pass in the Senate, and Schumer, there's nothing he can do except complain.
Right.
But I still think he's going to get blamed.
Blamed for
allowing something to pass that he had no ability to stop anyway. I think the left is so angry right now with what's going on. But both March and May are tune-ups for September.
And so this is where I was wrong. That's when the continuing resolution runs out, not May, but in September. We've kicked the can down the road. So that's when another government shutdown becomes, whatever that means, again, in September. That's when it becomes in play.
Well,
is that
yes
right?
And no. Yes and no.
This is like a giant chess game, isn't it?
It is. It is. But in September, that will be the vote on the budget that will begin October 1st of 2025 and extend for 12 months. So let's review here. What happened in September of 2025 was they couldn't agree on a budget, so they passed a continuing resolution. And there was 90 days. And then 90 days later, they still couldn't agree, so they passed another continuing resolution for 90 more days. And that took us up to March. And then they still couldn't agree, so they passed a continuing resolution with minor changes for 6 months, which then takes it to October 1st. Now, what will then happen, though, in September is the Republicans now are working on, especially in the House, but also in the Senate, but bills of taxes and spending originate in the House. And that's why I said the House first. The Republicans in the House are working on, like, for example, Trump has just signed an executive order closing the Department of Education. my guess is that a federal judge will rule that the president does not have the authority to close down an entire agency that has been written into law by a statute.
By Congress.
By Congress. And signed by a previous president.
Yes.
That's what I believe the ruling will be. And I think Trump knows that. So now the Republicans in September, the Republicans may pass into the 2026 budget, the beginning of for fiscal year October 1st, they may include in that budget the closure of the Department of Education as a matter of statute, as a matter of law. There'll be lots of other cuts. A lot of the stuff that you're seeing now with the DOGE efforts is identifying waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. In fact, Scott Bassett was on Laura Ingraham last night.
Secretary of Treasury?
He's the Secretary of Treasury, and he was on with one of the tech people who runs a very successful tech company, and he has voluntarily agreed to look at particular agencies' technology. And so he has been assigned to looking at the IRS's technology stack. And here's what he said last night. He said in 1991, Congress appropriated a few $100 million to overhaul the technology platform that the IRS operated on. And he said it is still, that was in 1991, and it was supposed to be done in less than 5 years. It is still operating on exactly the same platform.
24 years later.
More than 24 years later, 34 years
34.
later. 34 years
a decade.
later. Yeah.
34 years, third of a century.
And $15 billion has been spent, and the platform is still essentially the same. And what this guy said was interesting. He said, I've met with a lot of the technology people, the programmers, the coders, and he said, these are all smart people. He said, but they are not allowed to fix the system the way it ought to be fixed. He said they're not allowed to. And so I went to the people that they report to, and they couldn't explain why they're not allowed to either.
Now, this is fascinating. Just yesterday, I heard that they captured a couple of people on the FBI's top wanted list. I think two of them in Mexico. And they're saying this is really just letting good cops be good cops. They know what to do and how to do it. They weren't allowed to under previous rules. And you have a similar thing at the border. You know, that we know how to stop it. We were told you had to have a bunch of legislation in order to do it. Trump has said, no, you just needed a new president. Mm-hmm. And the flow through the border has just stopped. So it's just a matter of letting good people do what they know how to do.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
And there's a broader point about communism. It's not bad and stupid people. They're in a bad system.
Yes, exactly. And that's a great point here, because if the IRS had really, really efficient systems, it wouldn't need nearly as many people to run the IRS, to operate the IRS as we know it today. It wouldn't need nearly as many people. And therein lies the rub. As far as I'm concerned, I believe that it is the desire by the federal employee unions to maintain the number of people that drives much of the public policy that is determined by primarily the Democrat Party, because the Democrat Party's primary source of fundraising money comes from federal, state, and local government employee unions. And the government employee unions' business model is their revenue is determined by the number of members. That's the only way they can increase their revenue, is to increase the number of members.
So in that light, you know, presuming that's fully accurate, is it's never in their interest to cut employees.
Correct. And so consequently, Schumer has been under enormous pressure because Elon Musk is talking about cutting hundreds of thousands of government workers. Now, none of them have been cut yet. They've been fired, but then the judges have required them to be replaced. But in the September bill, and this is why I'm saying the September bill, which will be the budget for the next fiscal year, mm-hmm. I believe that is where all of these cuts will be put into law by statute. Now, there'll be a great battle there. Because in order to do that, Democrats will not support that, and Republicans have a very small majority, and in fact, there are two special elections in Florida for Matt Gaetz's seat and Waltz, the fellow who left the Congress to serve in the one of the undersecretaries, so there'll be two Republican seats in Florida where the special election is on April 1st.
So the seats have been Republican. Presumably, they will elect new Republicans into those seats. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but the Democrats are spending huge amounts of money trying to win those seats, and so that's just something to watch for because the Republican majority is very small.
Right.
And so at any rate, so now let's move forward so we get to September. And what we're witnessing, we've been talking about this, and we'll continue to talk about it. Is what we're witnessing now is our constitutional form of government under stress, and being under stress is not necessarily bad. Sometimes it's bad, but when you're playing in a championship game, you're under stress, and you're trying to play your very best. But that stress might also cause you to not play well. It might.
Yeah, I think we can say we're not in routine times, and we are in the playoffs, maybe the championship. Some people say if we don't get this fixed now, the country is in bad shape permanently.
Yeah.
And let's say a word about uncertainty. I heard this week someone complaining about farmers facing all this uncertainty with tariffs. Well, yes, they are. It's turmoil. It's not pleasant. But the alternative is certain decline, which is structural deficits that eventually bankrupt the country. And if we don't change that, the certainty of that is something to be avoided.
Right. But last time when Trump did in his first term, Trump had tariffs, and the retaliation was against states, the farmers. What Trump did then was he took part of the tariffs that he was collecting, and he gave it to the farmers who were being affected by the foreign tariffs. And so he was able to satisfy the political side so that the farmers who support Trump's policies would not turn against him. And that's just pure politics.
Yeah, there's a bunch of arguments to make about the merits and demerits of tariffs, right?
Yes.
And that's probably for another time. The point I was trying to make is about constitutional stress. It's uncertainty,
yes.
And we're applying rules in contexts they haven't been applied before. That's not a crisis, in my opinion. It's not that the Constitution is failing. As a matter of fact, I think it was Trey Gowdy or someone like that said we need more of the Constitution, not less of it.
Yeah, and I think what you just said is exactly right, that we're not in a crisis. I do think there's some federal judge rulings, local district judges whose rulings will be overturned by the Supreme Court.
Right.
I think there'll be some that are upheld by the Supreme Court. But what Trump is doing is, and I think the rulings that will be ultimately upheld will be upheld by the Supreme Court, and their claim will be that the executive branch can't close the Department of Education permanently. It takes an act of Congress to do that, for example.
Yes.
Now, what I do find interesting is that right now there's a battle between the president and the executive branch. That's what the battle is, because Trump is trying to shrink the size of the executive branch, and the government employee unions that represent the people whose jobs are affected. They are suing, and local judges are saying that Trump must pay people and he cannot cut the number of people who work. That, to me, will be an interesting question, and I would be surprised if the Supreme Court sides completely with the public employee unions. I'll be surprised.
This is a fascinating topic because you've said a conflict between the president and the executive branch. In
Yes.
the Constitution, the president is the executive branch. It says you have one executive, and then everybody else in the executive branch supposedly would work for him. It doesn't say we have a president and then a bunch of minions that are accountable to the Constitution and to the Congress. They're accountable to the president.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a lot of institutions that have been set up to evade political accountability, like the Consumer Financial Protection Board, the Federal Reserve. A bunch of those are set up to avoid the politics of presidential working, shall I say, or presidential politics. And that is a constitutional question.
Yes. and it's better to call it a question than a crisis.
Yes.
And so a lot of the issues that there are a lot of issues that will be resolved. But the other thing that happened, and this happened back in the 70s, is that Nixon did something that previous presidents had all done, and that is they had impounded funds that had been appropriated by Congress and signed into law by the president.
And impound means to keep them in reserve, to sequester them, to not spend them.
Not spend them, yes. And presidents had done that. Then Congress then passed a statute called the Anti-Impoundment Act that said that a president could not impound funds that had been appropriated by Congress and signed into law by a president. I think the Supreme Court ruled that statute was constitutional by a 5-4 ruling. And so now, and that's what the ruling, that's what now the question is does that mean that any money appropriated by Congress, and even if it's vague, and so I'm going to give you an example of the recent one, is that you've got this $20 billion that right at the end of the Biden administration, under the Environmental Protection Agency, they moved $20 billion into a bank account at Citibank to be distributed by dictates of the EPA. The appropriations weren't specified by Congress. And so Lee Zeldin has said the following recipients or prospective recipients are simply not doing the work of the environment. It's just political payoffs.
And he's secretary of
the EPA.
Of the EPA.
He's head of the EPA, and so he is
head of the EPA. He's not a cabinet secretary.
Well,
is EPA?
I think the Environmental Protection Agency. He's the director of the agency, and he's the one who has the authority,
right,
supposedly,
to spend the money.
And to identify fraud.
Yes.
And not spend it on the basis of fraud.
Yes.
And so it's going to be a lower court judge has ruled that he has to spend the money. Now they're suing the judge, and so he's going to hold that $20 billion, because once you've spent it, once it's out, if the Supreme Court rules in your favor, it'd be almost impossible to get it back. And so these are the battles, Mike, that are going on right now, and in my lifetime, I've never seen anything like it. And I think the reason for it is that we do have $36 trillion of debt, and there are many, many people. And when I say many, many people, I'm talking about the voters. The voters understand that we are at a point where if we continue in the direction we're headed, catastrophe awaits us. And it's not sometime 40 or 50 years down the road. It's probably somewhere between 3 and 10. Which is not our children and grandchildren, it's all of us.
So our economy is around $31 trillion, some number like that?
Something like that.
So this is larger than our entire economy. The government takes in about $7 trillion. Right?
No, it doesn't take in $7 trillion. It spends.
It takes in around 6. Some numbers 5.
Takes in around 5.
Okay. So you have $37 trillion that's never going to be paid off. I think we touched on this in a prior podcast. Mm-hmm. There's not enough money in the federal budget to pay off all the old stuff and keep your current stuff going. Mm-hmm. So the debt service keeps expanding, meaning the cost every year to pay the interest on what we've already borrowed.
Yes.
If we keep borrowing, the snowball gets ahead of us and we go bankrupt.
Yes.
So the only way out of this is to grow the economy at a rate that makes that debt relatively smaller.
Relatively. And that's the key word.
Smaller.
It makes the debt compared to the economy relatively smaller. It doesn't reduce the debt. It just means that it is hopefully our economy. Let's say in the next few years the debt goes from 36 trillion to say 41 trillion, but the economy grows to 40 trillion. Well, now all of a sudden, instead of it being as much out of whack as it is now, as a percentage, it's less, and so the burden is a lower burden. And so now
this is why we're also addressing what we call the tax cuts now, because essentially the cuts were put in place in 2017. If we don't continue them, tax rates are going to go up substantially. It will slow the economy.
Well, and so
we can't grow our way out of it. There's
some people who argue, and so this is why we're going to go back and look at the Depression. There's some people who argue that what we need to reduce the deficit is a large increase in tax rates. There's some people who argue that, and so they will oppose. The Democrats will likely oppose
because they think they're going to get more money into the government with higher tax rates.
Yes, that's what they think. Okay, and so then the question is, well, do higher tax rates generate greater prosperity? That's the fundamental question. So let's switch gears here just for a second, and let's look at the 1930s, because that is a period. In fact, I read an article recently that Trump is trying to do the opposite of what Roosevelt did 100 years ago, and that no president since FDR has done anything to try to reverse the trends that were put in place by FDR and the policies that were put in place. So let's review, because we've talked about this in a previous podcast, but in this context, the fundamental question is, do higher taxes on essentially on everybody, do they generate more revenue, and do they generate more prosperity over time? Because if you generate more revenue for 1 year and you crush the economy, destroy the economy, so that the second, third, and fourth year things get terrible, then you haven't accomplished your goal.
So one other way of stating this question is, do higher tax rates produce higher tax revenue?
And prosperity. It has to produce both.
Yes.
And prosperity.
Yeah. Well, I would say prosperity follows from a greater expansion of the economy.
Yes.
Okay. And so what we hear in our public discourse is generally the equation of tax rates and tax revenue, as if they are in sync.
Yes.
Okay. And so what Arthur Laffer said in the Reagan administration is that you can cut tax rates and you get more revenue because you unleash economic activity. So you're getting a smaller percentage of a larger amount of economic activity, which is what we have to grow out of this debt.
Yes, and Dr. Laffer also said something else that I think he put two stakes in the ground. He said there are two tax rates that will generate no revenue at all. He said a 0% tax rate will generate nothing. 100% tax rate will generate nothing. Because no one is going to work if 100% of what they earn goes to taxes.
And so in the middle, there's a curve that looks like the St. Louis Arch.
And it's not necessarily at 50%.
Yeah, we don't know exactly where it is. It's not a lab that will test it. But we know that it's an inverted U, an upside-down U. And if you're on the right side of that U, what it means is that if you go back to the left, you reduce tax rates, the economy will get bigger and you get more revenue. If you keep going too far, then the rates and the revenue are in sync at very low rates.
Yeah.
So there's some middle, and we think that we're past that middle, so that we can prosper by reducing rates and increasing revenue. And so everybody's making more money.
And this is the difference with Trump and previous presidents. Trump wants to dramatically cut spending on the regulatory state and cut the regulations. In his first term, Trump mandated to all the regulatory agencies that for every regulation they proposed, they had to eliminate 2. This time he is saying for every regulation you propose, you must eliminate 10.
And this is what you mean by nothing changing since FDR, because the regulatory state has consistently expanded since that time.
Yes. Yeah. And so what we're living in, so let's go back to the Depression. At the beginning of the Depression, you had unemployment rates of over 20% in 1933 when it was at its worst. You had 1933, and you had tax rates of 25%, the top marginal tax rate. Roosevelt got elected. He was elected and took office in 33, and he raised the top marginal tax rate and all other tax rates, but he raised the top marginal tax rate from 25 to 63. And he dramatically increased federal spending. I mean, we're talking huge increases in federal spending. And as a result of that increase in federal spending, it drove the unemployment rate from over 20% to about 9%. And so that all looked pretty good. And then he raised tax rates again from 63% to in the 70s. And by the way, the middle income tax rates were also going up. But then after the federal spending, the giant blast of federal spending increased employment with just the money. But then by 1936, the economy was now turning back down again. And 37 and 38, they are called the Depression within the Depression. And even though there were giant increases in tax rates and giant increases in spending, by 37 and 38, the unemployment rate had gone from 9% back up to 15%. And so the effect, and I call the metaphor that I use is when you have a dramatic increase in federal spending and perhaps a giant increase in federal tax rates, but certainly the spending is like Red Bull. If I'm driving on a trip and I'm getting sleepy and I'm driving, I will pull into a convenience store and I'll get a Red Bull. And I know that Red Bull is going to make me very awake for the next 3 hours.
Right.
But when that Red Bull wears off,
hangover.
I'm going to be much more tired than I was at the beginning. And so when you have giant increases in spending, and this is, and to me, the giant increases in spending is as a percentage of the economy, then that is bad. Ultimately, it's bad. It has a short-term effect that's positive and longer-term negative.
There's two things I would add. One is that Milton Friedman said, ultimately, the burden of government is measured by what it spends because it's going to have to pay for it either in taxes or in inflation.
Yes.
The people are going to end up paying for it in one way or the other.
Yes.
So that's the key measure to look at is how much it spends, which we're now starting to change and try to reduce spending.
Yeah, and Mike, this is a key point, and that is that the reason that we had the Biden inflation was because spending jumped from pre-COVID federal spending was 20%
of the GDP.
Of the GDP.
Of the overall economy.
Yes. And Biden jumped it to 25%.
Yes.
And so the substantial increase in the rate of spending brought about inflation. And so with Trump.
And some of that was related to the COVID, but then it didn't go back after COVID was over.
That's correct. I mean, the inflation peaked well after COVID had
They're paying off the money that had been spent.
Yes. And but the appropriation, the spending kept going.
Right.
In other words, they appropriated it, but it kept going for it has to be pushed into the economy to drive inflation.
Let me say a word about appropriation because we went past it a few minutes ago. What's being questioned is what does appropriation mean? What the left is saying is if we appropriate it, you've got to spend it. Okay, appropriation may mean you've got this much money to spend to solve a problem. If you don't need it all, you don't have to spend it all. That's the way I would do it if I was running a corporation. And let's say you're my CEO or I'm your CEO. You give me an amount of money, I'll spend what I need to accomplish the purpose and not the rest of it because it's just laying there. That's what government does. I've been in government where they spend up at the end of the year,
right? So
they don't get cut next year to a lower level because they didn't need that much money. So at the end of the budget year, often a bunch of money is wasted.
Yes, and so what you have here, and this is where we're getting into where we're kind of predicting here that assuming that these tax cuts pass in May and
existing tax rates
and take effect immediately,
yes,
then that will act as a stimulus to the economy because people will have more money in their own pockets. It won't mean the government is stimulating the economy with more spending. Right. By government, it'll be that people are keeping more of their money, and they'll be willing to, and they will likely work harder and longer because they benefit from doing so.
And it also means there will be more certainty about future tax rates, so people will invest.
Yes.
Right now, you have in law that these tax rates are going to go up, and you can expect a moderating effect on economic activity and investment, et cetera. If I am an owner of a business, high-income individual, and I know I'm going to get to keep more of my money, I will invest more of it now.
Yes.
Right.
And so that's what's going to happen. But the other thing that's going to happen, and this is what's new, in the past we've had tax cuts. In the past we've had slight reductions in spending for very short periods of time. That was the first 18 months of Reagan, and that's the only time in my lifetime that spending has gone down in any measurable way. And it was measurable in that 18 months, but then it returned to the norm.
Right.
What Trump is working on, and whether or not it happens in September is still an open question, is I believe he wants to cut federal spending almost exclusively in the regulatory state from approximately $2 trillion down to cut it somewhere between $300 and $500 billion per year, and that's a huge cut.
Right.
That's a huge cut, and maybe he even pushes for more. And
so that's what, about 12 to 25%, something like that,
of
the category of spending that you're talking about, the
regulatory
25%. Yeah,
25%. Somewhere between 300 and say 600 billion of 2 trillion.
Right.
So it could be a large amount. But the other thing that he's going to be doing is I think he's going to be dramatically cutting the regulations. And this is where it's interesting, is that if a regulation is in place, does the president have the authority to do away with the regulation, or does the regulatory agency have to say we don't need this regulation anymore? I would like to think that since the regulators report to the president, that the president can do that. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of concern that the tax cuts will lead to larger deficits in the short term. And I suppose that's possible. But if spending in the short term actually goes down, then the people who are forecasting inflation because of a slight increase in the deficit in the short term, I think they're wrong, because I think that inflation is a function of changes in government, rapid changes in government spending on the upside. Now what you're going to see is a rapid change in government spending on the downside, which is not necessarily deflationary, but it certainly isn't inflationary.
Right.
And so that's kind of where we are. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take just a few minutes and I'd go to an article that I read called the "What's Wrong with China in 8 Charts." And so we're going to pull this up here, and if you would scroll on down to the very first chart. Look at this right here. This is residential construction, and in China, just to a little bit of a repeat, in 1980, when Deng Xiaoping changed the way that China would operate, it's still going to be an authoritarian form of government, but it would allow private investment, and it would allow entrepreneurship, and it would allow different things, but it still didn't allow political freedom. But it did allow economic freedom up to a point.
Yes.
And so in 1980, the government of China owned 100% of the land. Now that's hard for us to understand, so I'm going to say it again. The government of China owned 100% of the land in China. And when Deng Xiaoping decided to change things, he told the local governments, the city governments, the state government, the provinces, and in China, Shanghai, the city of Shanghai is a province. The city of Beijing is a province. All of the other cities in China are in provinces that are larger than just the city. But what Deng Xiaoping did was he told the heads of the provinces, he said, you can sell the land to private developers on a 99-year lease, fully paid for up front. And you can then use the proceeds from the sale of that land to finance the operations of the local government.
So are they selling it or leasing it for 199 years?
Well, sell it, lease it, 99 years. The people who are buying it weren't worried about what was going to happen in 99 years. So you could argue whatever you want. But
okay.
but the deal was, the point was it was fully paid up front. So it wasn't leased over 99 years where you pay annually.
Right.
So they got all their money up front. And then the local governments were then allowed to use that money to operate the local government. And so that worked great for about 25 years because the government was selling land. And as you can see from this chart, the number of square meters of residential construction grew dramatically from the year 2000. And it was growing actually even before then, but it particularly took off in 2000. And it grew dramatically all the way up to about 2022 or 2023.
And so for those who can't see the chart and listeners, it looks like a hockey stick.
Yes.
Basically, it's just an incline or a ramp,
yes.
An incline up to about 2020, and then off it goes.
Yes.
Off the cliff.
Yes, and it hadn't hit bottom yet. And for those who can't see the chart, it has not hit. And this chart will be available from Our Generation's website as a link.
Website.
But this is a great article to read, and we went through what we called our great recession.
You and I? You mean you and I, or you mean
and I
US?
and our country, the U.S. Okay. Well, we were part of it. We lived through it. And that was from 2009 to 2013.
Right.
And at that time, because of government policies, 2 to 3 million housing units were built that really were greater than the real demand. And so you had a reduction in the value of housing for a period of about 5 years. And then it recovered as the population grew and new housing construction stopped. It took care of itself. In China, at the peak of this chart in 2022, according to another Wall Street Journal article, there's as many as 90 million residential units in China that are either finished and unoccupied or in various stages of construction. And the money for the ones that are in various stages of construction has dried up.
So this is economics 101. When you have an oversupply, then prices go down.
Yes.
Because buyers have a lot more alternatives and they just go to somewhere cheaper.
Yes.
And so people that own property there now have bought it, and presumably it's worth less than they may have paid for it.
Yes.
And they may be the same people that loaned money by buying bonds.
Well, but they also or maybe they borrowed money. Maybe they're on the hook for housing units that they bought that they expected to go up in value.
So they have a mortgage that's now bigger than.
Yes. They can't rent it. They can't sell it. They're stuck with it. And so let's go to the next chart. And what we see is this is consumer confidence. Now the previous chart showed that in 2022 the housing market collapsed. That's the previous chart. This chart shows that in 2022 the consumer confidence index went from about 120 to 125, and it collapsed to close to 85. And it has been in the 85 level ever since. And this is data coming out of China.
Whatever those numbers mean, it's off about a third.
Yes, but consumer confidence, if it falls a third, it's a lot.
It's a lot.
That is a huge amount.
Right.
And so let's go to that next chart, and this is the consumer prices. Now you can see that there was this big bubble in this chart, big bubble in inflation in the other countries of the world, the Eurozone, the U.S. and Japan, in around 1923, and then prices have come down. In China, there was a small inflation in that same time period, but now China is experiencing a bit of a deflation. And part of the reason for the deflation is that people who bought all these housing units and are having to pay those mortgages, even though they're getting no income, they now don't have money to spend on other things. And so consequently, the demand for other things is going down. Well, if you're the seller of the other things and people aren't buying them, what do you have to do?
Cut your prices.
You have to cut your prices. And so what we're now seeing is that China is experiencing a bit of a deflation. Now, what that means is still unknown, because deflations can get out of control.
So let me raise a technical question here that we can't resolve. We don't have time for it. But this chart says consumer prices. Okay, it doesn't say inflation, which is the value of money. Prices may not be the same as inflation.
Okay.
Generally, they're taken to be the same. So if egg prices go up, as they have, because we killed off tens of millions of chickens for disease prevention, so that means eggs are more expensive. We can't buy as much gas. That's not inflationary. Our money may be worth the same. We spend it on different things. But here, we're showing prices are going down.
Right.
The question is, what's the value of money? Is it just that prices have gone down and you can buy more of everything because you still have the same amount of money?
Well, you don't have the same amount of money, and that's the point, is that you now have a burden in China because of that real estate. You now have a burden of carrying an asset that is not worth as much as what you paid for it, but you are still having to pay the mortgage.
Yeah, so your income is a separate measure that's not shown on here. This is showing prices, right? What I would be interested to know is a measure of inflation, and I'm confused about this. I've asked professors of finance to help me separate out what's the difference in a price reduction and an inflation reduction, and the answers are not easy.
Well, I'm going to suggest this. I'm going to suggest that while they're not the same person, they're twins.
Yes,
They're
very
not
much, they're
necessarily
correlated.
identical, but they are very, very correlated.
They're correlated. But I want to make the point that just because something goes up in price, that does not mean there's inflation. It means there's a supply issue, and you spend more money on gas instead of eggs, instead of housing, instead of something else.
But it can be inflation. It doesn't. I'm saying it's not the opposite. It can be. It can be that prices go up because there is inflation.
They're correlated.
In a particular item, like the one you talked about,
right.
You can have an increase in the price of one thing for a reason, like as you said, chickens were killed in large numbers, and therefore the number of eggs available went down, so therefore the price went up. So I can understand that, but this is general consumer prices, not one, and so
yes.
this is much more of a reflection of an inflation chart would be almost the same as this.
Okay.
So let's move to the next one, and this shows the debt as a percentage. Now we talk about the debt in our country as being high, and it is. Our debt is high. And our aggregate debt, including government, private debt, all of the different, this chart, for those who can't see it, includes government debt, household debt, and non-financial corporations debt. In the United States, for us, that represents about 250% of our GDP. In the U.S., about 250%.
So the numbers are it's 250% of our government income.
No. GDP
Of GDP?
We have a $31 billion GDP.
Trillion.
It's a trillion.
Yeah.
And if you add up all the debt,
okay.
government debt, private debt,
okay.
all the debt,
yeah.
it's about 75 to 80 trillion dollars
okay.
of debt.
It's 35 in the federal. That's what I was thinking. That's
yes.
about 110 or 20%.
Yes.
But if you add all the rest, it's 3 times.
It's 250.
Let's put this in personal terms. If you make $50,000 a year, what this is saying is that together we're obligated to $150,000 worth of debt.
Well, not exactly, Mike. I mean, with the government debt, that's true. But with private debt might very well be financed completely by the borrower. It's not necessary. It's just an indicator. And what I'm trying to say here is that we have our total debt, federal, our government debt and private debt. Is 250% of our GDP. In China, it is over 300% of their GDP, and their debt is much more determined by government policy than our debt. Certainly, our federal debt is determined by government policy, but private sector debt is not determined for the most part by government policy. In China, it is. The banks are owned in China. The banks are owned by the government.
Right.
And so what I'm saying is the Chinese economy. So let's go to the next chart. This shows the estimated population. And so for those who are just looking, the population in 1950 was a little under 600 million people. The population at around 2020, which is about right in this period, 2020, 2025, is peaking at a little over 1.4 billion. But in 1980, China, Deng Xiaoping put in what they call the one-child policy, which meant that every female in China was allowed to have one child. And so consequently, that had very, very good economic benefits for about 25 years.
Fewer mouths to feed.
Fewer mouths to feed and more ability to work because they only had one child.
So now there are fewer parents to have new babies.
Yes, and the percentage of people over 55 as a percentage of their economy now is becoming a much larger share. And over the next 15 years, it will become even a larger share. And then the problem that China will have is they will have a very, very significant percentage of their population that is too old to work as well as they worked 20 years prior.
So this is a huge demographic problem, and it's combined with a huge debt problem. That's
yes.
3 times as big as ours.
That's what I'm trying to get across. China has some serious problems that are worth studying and understanding, just so that you have perspective on other policies. Because what these policies as they were that they affect China, they would affect us if we had the same ones, but we don't. But it's good to know that. So let's go to the next chart. And this is interesting because this gets to what you were talking about, question that you raised earlier. This is the foreign investment chart and shows that starts at around 2010, and it shows that direct investment and portfolio investment by foreigners into China was substantial. It was in the billions, tens of billions of dollars for a period of about 10 years. And it was probably this chart, if it went back farther, would probably show similar results. But since in the last 4 or 5 years, the amount of direct investment into China by foreigners has dropped considerably. And according to a lot of the things that I read, a lot of the people who live in China who have money are trying to figure out ways to get some or all of their money out of China.
Oh, yeah. If you go to Vancouver or Seattle, some areas up there, there's a lot of property owned by Chinese.
Yes. And they had to be a little tricky on how they got it out, and it's becoming more difficult. But here's what's interesting. The more difficult the Chinese government makes it to get your money out of China, the incentive to not invest in China increases. And so they end up thinking they're accomplishing one thing, but they're actually accomplishing the opposite, in that the amount of money available for investing is actually on net going down because they're getting no foreign investment. Now, compare this to Trump. Since Trump has been president, which is just now 60 days, he's announced over $2 trillion of direct investment in the United States by foreign countries or foreign entities who are going to be investing to build automobile factories, chip factories, all kinds of manufacturing. And the manufacturing that will be built, that will be new, will be the highest tech manufacturing facilities in the history of the world.
So the U.S. has the largest economy in the world,
yes.
An enormous demand. And what Trump is saying is if you want to sell into our enormous market, you need to make your stuff here. Otherwise, you pay a price to import it into the United States.
Yeah.
Right. Now, this is against conventional economic theory, which is that you specialize and you trade at low rates of taxation and everybody does what they do best and things expand. So this is another kind of thing we're testing now is how can tariffs work? It's industrial policy and there's reason to oppose it, but it also is correcting some abuses we've seen for a long time where other people wouldn't let us invest in their country.
Well, not invest, sell product.
Sell, yeah, that's what I should have said.
And so this is the key point here, is that, and Adam Smith talked about this, so if you're interested in understanding the great thinkers, once again, we're going to mention the giantsofpoliticalthought.com, giantsofpoliticalthought.com. You can go there and buy these wonderful audio programs that we produced. It explains the ideas of history's most influential thinkers. But Adam Smith talked about free trade.
Right.
But one of the things he said that was an essential element of free trade was equal trade. And so if one side is imposing tariffs and the other side is not, then the side that is not imposing tariffs will end up importing a great deal more than it is exporting.
Right.
And that's the imbalance that Trump is trying to address.
Yes.
And so Trump has made it very clear that he said, I'm going to impose tariffs on those countries that are imposing tariffs or having other types of restrictions that have the same effect as tariffs. We're going to do that. But if those other countries will lower their tariffs, that we will lower ours. So the word that he uses is reciprocal. And that is another word for equal treatment.
More symmetric.
Yes, yeah. And so as you say, this question of tariffs and how it affects particular industries. But the other thing that Trump is doing is he is making it where if you invest money in the United States to build things, yes, you can sell them in the United States, but we're going to be so business friendly that you can also build it at a competitive price to export it.
This is how you grow your way out of a huge debt.
And that's the key.
And China will not be able to do that.
China will not. That's why I wanted to bring up the situation in China. I wanted to compare it to our depression, and then talk about our current situation. So, Mike, I've enjoyed today tremendously, and I hope that we have offered some insights that our listeners and viewers can take.
Well, we've
take
dug
to heart.
into the weeds pretty extensively,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of subtleties and nuance and complications. It's helped by graphs. If you can see those visually, if you're just listening audioly, maybe look online to check into some of these things.
Yeah,
We'll continue this, but this is the meat of the problems that we're having, to dig into these details, and I think they clarify what we've got to do to get out of it.
Yeah, so just in closing, I want to mention two things. You can go to FromOurGeneration.com, FromOurGeneration.com, and there are links to many of the articles that we refer to in the podcast. And the other is, we certainly encourage folks to go to giantsofpoliticalthought.com and purchase the audio programs that provide the listeners with the ideas of thinkers who have changed the world.
And it's just amazing to hear them talk about the problems they had and the solutions they came up with and how relevant they are to the ones we're dealing with. This is the point. It's not dry history. It is live history. And these people were just like us in lots of ways, different in some, but very much like us. Smart people. We need to learn from them.
Yes. Thank you very much.